Welcome to our class on biblical geography. And we're going to focus specifically on the land of Israel. And as we look at Israel throughout its history in the pages of the Bible, many times Israel struggled with idolatry. And that struggle with idolatry was tied to the characteristics of this place, the climate of this place. They were often tempted to worship Baal, the storm god. And as we'll see, that Israel's a land of meager rainfall. And when it doesn't rain, that means there's a famine, people don't eat. And so there was this temptation to trust in other gods to provide for their daily bread, provide for their food. Now, you could play chess without a chessboard. And, if you already know how to play chess, you kind of know where the players go and the movement of the various pieces. But, it's pretty hard to play chess without a chessboard. So much easier to have the chessboard. And the land of Israel is the playing board for the Bible. Okay? Once you understand the playing board of the Bible, the geography of Israel, then you know why they went in this place and that place, and the various movements and events. Makes understanding the Bible that much easier. The land really hasn't changed. While customs, culture, and language have changed since Bible time, the geography is still the same. The mountains, valleys, rivers, lakes, deserts are all in the same place. And knowing the geography of the Bible will help us connect us with the people of the Bible. We're going to look at Israel divided up into 4 sections. I call this the 4-part division of the land. So we're going to have 4 strips, so to speak. The coastal plain, the central mountainous spine, the Rift Valley, and then to the far east would be the Transjordan. So let's look at each of these areas or sections or regions of the land of Israel. The coastal plain, as the name implies, it's along the Mediterranean Sea, it's a plain, it's flat, and for the most part this is for where the Philistines lived for a good bit of Old Testament history. As we move to the east to the central mountainous spine, that area is kind of the opposite of the coastal plain. It's not flat, it's mountainous, it's not as fertile as the coastal plain. Instead of the Philistines living there, this is where the Israelites lived for much of Old Testament history. The central mountainous spine encompasses the hills of Galilee, Samaria, and Judah. The only break in that range of mountains is the Jezreel Valley, which is just to the southwest of the Sea of Galilee. We call it a spine because it kind of looks like the bumps on somebody's back on the spine. If we were to cut Israel at the waist, slice it open and then peel it back and then look to the north, this is what we would see. We would see the landscape coming up at sea level, the Mediterranean Sea, as we moved eastward, going up to the central mountains, and then descending down into the Rift Valley or Jordan Valley, and then moving back up on the other side to the Transjordan. So the Rift Valley is a very low area. In fact, at the shore of the Dead Sea, this is the lowest point on the face of the earth. The Rift Valley extends from Turkey all the way down to Mozambique, Africa. And that portion of the Rift Valley in Israel is called the Jordan Valley, but it's part of a much longer geographic fault in the Earth's surface called the Rift Valley. That area is quite low compared to the hills to the west and to the east. In this picture you see the Dead Sea in the foreground. We're looking north. So the Rift Valley with the Dead Sea is actually below sea level. The Sea of Galilee is actually below sea level. And let's move over to the Transjordan. So we have to ascend back up to the other side as we move east. And the Transjordan can be described as a high-level plateau on the other side, roughly the same elevation as the central mountainous spine. A good way to think of Israel is as a land between. A land between Europe, Asia, and Africa. God strategically put Israel in a place where if somebody's going from Africa over to Asia, they pass through the land of Israel. If somebody wants to go from Europe to Africa, they pass through the land of Israel. And it's also a land between the superpowers of the ancient world. We have Egypt in the south, and then the river cultures in the area of Mesopotamia, like Assyria, Babylon, Persia. And if these empires wanted to go and conquer, say, Egypt in the southwest, they would have to pass right through Israel along the way because of the Fertile Crescent. And so the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Mesopotamia provide water for crops to grow. And so if you wanted to travel from that area down to Egypt, you would follow the Fertile Crescent, which hugs the coast where there's rainfall by the Mediterranean. If you were to go farther east, it turns to desert. And then eventually down at the Nile, which also has water available, and they use that for farming there in Egypt. So the Fertile Crescent pretty much dictates where people would travel in ancient times and where armies would travel. Well, God wanted His people to grow in their faith. So He put them in a place, Israel, so that they would learn to trust Him. And so Israel really is a land of faith. First off, is protection from their enemies. As we've mentioned, Israel is on the highway between the great superpowers of the ancient world. And the problem is, when you live on the highway, unless you're protected and unless you know how to avoid the traffic, you're going to get run over. And that's what happened many times in Israel's history. When they were disobedient to the covenant, God would forsake them over to their enemies, and they would get overrun by their enemies. But when they were faithful to the covenant, they prospered, and God gave them protection from their enemies. The Philistines were a thorn in the flesh for the Israelites through much of the Old Testament period. They didn't originate in the land of Canaan, but came from Greece and Crete around 1200 BC. So they started migrating, and as they went, they just wreaked havoc and conquered the peoples that where they inhabited their new land. Now this is an Egyptian chariot, but we're going to talk about Philistine chariots. And the Philistines were well advanced in chariot technology. And chariots work good on the flat ground, where they can maneuver and you can strike your enemy quickly. And so the Philistines liked living in a flat area and enabled them to use chariots to their advantage. Isaiah 42:6 says, I am the Lord, I have called you in righteousness. I will also hold you by the hand and watch over you. I will appoint you as a covenant to the people, as a light to the nations. So we see God wanted Israel to be a light to the nations. And in Genesis 12:3, the promise to Abraham, and I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Genesis 12:3. So God's intent for Israel was to be a blessing to the nations, to be a light to the nations. And there is a major international highway that runs along the coast. It has no name in the Bible. We just refer to it as the International Coastal Highway. But God's plan was for Israel to have an influence on those Gentiles traveling up and down that international route from Egypt to Mesopotamia. His plan was for Israel to conquer the entire nation. But in the days of Joshua, they had difficulty conquering the coastal plain, and later David would even have trouble with the Philistines. So Israel never really conquered the coastal plain, and thus did not have the influence over the nations, mainly because they shrunk back in disbelief. They didn't trust God to enable them to defeat their enemies on the coast. Well, another way God was building Israel's faith, we saw first in protection, but we also see in the provision of food through rainfall. Rainfall is essential for crops. We've already mentioned that Israel gets a meager amount of rain, but that diminishes as we travel south and east. Now in Egypt or in Mesopotamia, river cultures, with the rivers nearby, if you need water, you just take a shaduf and you can lift water and water your fields. In Egypt, even to this day, they use a device called Archimedes' screw. Kind of has a spiral inside, and they rotate a lever and it lifts the water into their fields. So it really didn't have to rain in these river cultures. They really weren't dependent on rainfall. But that's not the case in Israel, because there's no river nearby. The Jordan River happens to be deep in the Jordan Valley, which is the lowest place on the face of the earth, quite far from the cities in the hill country. So nobody's going to go all the way down there to access water. So it really didn't benefit the Israelites in any way. So the Israelites were dependent upon God to provide rain. And so in the Bible, when we read about a famine, that's more than likely due to lack of rainfall. So they had to depend on God for rain.